start. Good morning and welcome. This morning it gives me great pleasure to introduce Father Douglas Dales, who is going to be our first speaker this morning, on our second day of the conference. Douglas is currently an Anglican parish priest in the Diocese of Oxford and was previously chaplain at Marlborough College for about 25 years, I believe. He has written several studies on early church history and theology and has recently completed 3 volumes on Saint Bonavera. He is currently a chairman of the Friends of Mount Athos and has been a member for some 15 years and is a regular visitor to the mountain. So he's a very appropriate person to start this morning's session. And he'll be giving a paper entitled, What is Pilgrimage? The Early Western Church's Understanding. Douglas, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. But before I begin, can I just briefly say first that we've had a wonderful icon delivered today of the saints of East Anglia, some of whom are part of this story, so that's why we placed that here. And the second thing is, as far as the bookstore is concerned, I think it will indeed be open from the coffee break onwards. It's a great feast of wonderful things, so do please go and look at it and get some books. If you want to make an electronic payment, then Chris Thomas is the man. He's got the magic machine, and if you can connect with him at any point, yes.
Could you get your voice closer to the microphone?
Yes. Is it switched on?
It is, yes.
Is it on? Is that better? How's that? Can you hear me now? Yes. Okay, so Chris Thomas is your man if you wish to make electronic payments of books, which if you buy 20 you may wish to do. Otherwise, connect with Maria, or indeed my wife Geraldine, and obviously because we've got 3 different sources which have to be remunerated, so it's quite important that it's done carefully. But they're lovely collection of books, so please do make the most of that. Very good. Well now, I decided that the cut-off would be the year 1000. This is a totally wrong position. You can't see. Machines. So I cut off at 1000 AD because it seemed to me that you can't go on forever in the Middle Ages, and also because the early period is a very interesting example of the interaction between. Is that a radio mic? Is that a radio?
You can use that.
Yeah, this is an absolute pain. Sorry, excuse me, I hate these things, but it's just so, as they use that ghastly phrase, in your face. Read your lectures here. Try to read it. One day in years to come. One day they will have a kind of ribbon stretched across clergymen's robes long after this technology is finished. And people will say, what's that all about? Because they're wearing these machines.
Should we turn off the other microphone on the table?
How do you turn it off? Right. Is that better?
No, it's still making noise.
Can I get away with that? Do I need a microphone at all? Right, let's go. Without it. No, can you hear? Can you hear me? I'll project. This is paid. So, Christian pilgrimage from the West took off in the 4th century after Constantine protected the church from persecution, and his mother Helena became closely associated with the recovery of the principal Christian sites in Jerusalem and elsewhere, including discovering, it was believed, the relic of the true cross. Major basilica were created on the alleged sites of the cross and the resurrection in the Holy City, and of the Nativity in Bethlehem. And early in the 4th century, a traveller from Bordeaux recorded his experiences in the Holy Land during a visit dated to 333, which is really quite early. A most interesting and famous account of another pilgrimage from the west was composed by an intrepid woman pilgrim from Spain called Egeria, writing early in the 5th century, sometime between 404 and 417. It is incomplete as it stands, but it portrays vividly and in detail the liturgical life of the churches of Jerusalem, and also recounts a visit to monastic communities at the foot of Mount Sinai. It is matched by a later account by a pilgrim from Piacenza in Italy, writing sometime between 551 and 570, who also visited the monastery at Sinai, which was by now a well-established institution, having been fortified by the Emperor Justinian. Its reputation was well known in the West, and Pope Gregory the Great sent gifts to furnish its infirmary, writing directly to its abbot John in the year 600. Gregory also wrote with more personal gifts to a priest called Palladius, who was living there. In an earlier letter, written in the summer of 594, to a friend and noble lady called Rusticiana, Gregory commented on her reported pilgrimage to the Holy Land and to the monastery of Sinai, chiding her for taking too superficial an interest as a mere tourist. But earlier he had encouraged her to embark on the pilgrimage for the good of her soul. Gregory would himself have dearly loved to go to Sinai, but he doubted that Rusticiana had taken to heart all the holy things and people that she'd seen on her travels. It's notable that the monastery at Sinai remained on the spiritual horizon of Western Christians long before the Crusades made visiting it so popular. For example, an ancient Latin psalter buried in the famous library in the monastery of Sinai is a crucial witness to Spanish Mozarabic liturgical use at the time of Charlemagne. Well, archaeology has amplified the picture given by these striking texts. For Western Christians in the 4th century and thereafter, Rome became the principal point of pilgrimage and devotion. The rule of Constantine marked a key moment in the development of the catacombs as places of pilgrimage. The roots of such devotion lay in the older practice of commemorating there the death and burial of early Christian martyrs and later others. But under Pope Damasus, who was Pope from 366 to 84, the formal cult of the martyrs took off in conjunction with the building of magnificent basilican churches in Rome itself, notably St. Peter's, St. John Lateran with its baptistry, and St. Paul outside the walls. Burial near the tombs of the martyrs became highly desirable, as did collecting relics associated with such places in the form of oil or dust or cloths that had touched the corporeal remains of the saints. A notable site in Rome was on the Appian Way, where elaborate facilities were built for pilgrims coming to venerate the memorial of Peter and Paul near where the Church of San Sebastiano now stands. They left graffiti expressing their pious hopes and prayers, and this was paralleled by the creation of the first basilica of St. Paul outside the walls on the Via Ostia, close to where his martyrdom had been similarly venerated. Now this new basilica embodied, in a highly visible way to visitors coming into Rome from the port, the pact between the emperor and the church. Symptomatic of this appropriation of the martyr tradition of Rome, which the popes exploited to such dramatic effect, were other relics associated with the Holy City and its saints. And these disseminated its influence in tangible form far and wide, being eminently portable. Reliquaries began to appear early in the 5th century, decorated with the images of martyrs and the saints. And this artistic development was closely paralleled by Christian sarcophagi, whose decoration marks the transition from pagan to Christian symbolism. Relics were sought for the consecration of new churches, enabling worshippers to feel spiritually and physically connected with Rome as the holy city of the martyrs, full of sacred sites. The only comparable point of influence at this time was, of course, Jerusalem itself, from which devotion to the true cross sprang, and from which there flowed a distinctive tide of reliquaries associated with it. In a letter of Paulinus of Nola to Sulpicius Severus, who was the biographer of St. Martin of Tours, written around the year 402, he was able to offer a fragment of the true cross that had been given to him by a noble woman pilgrim who had herself received it directly from the bishop in Jerusalem. An epitome of this complex web of spiritual association and pilgrimage may be found in the treasury of Monza Cathedral, north of Milan. The church was created by Queen Theodelinda, the wife of the King of Lombardy. She lived between 570 and 627 and was a friend and protégé of Gregory the Great, active in reconciling differing Catholic populations, as well as drawing the Arian Lombards, including her husband, closer to the Catholic fold. There remain there 26 glass ampullae, little portable vessels filled originally with oil from lamps, but burning at the shrines of various martyrs in Rome. Alongside these are 16 beautifully decorated metal ampullae from the Holy Land, again originally filled with oil from lamps from various shrines. There is also a 7th century register containing a list of the martyrs from whose tombs these relics emanated. The metal ampullae from the Holy Land date from before the Persian conquest of Jerusalem in 614, which led to a temporary ban on Christian pilgrimage there for a while. They're superbly decorated, mirroring early Christian mosaics and other church decorations. And no less striking is the royal jewellery at Monza, inspired by Christian tradition coming from Byzantium and from Rome itself, as well as from Lombard workshops. One such example is the Taratech of Adolard, a reliquary of the true cross from the end of the 6th century, named for Theodelinda's son, and probably a gift of Gregory the Great to her for his baptism in 603. It's believed to have been a gift from the Patriarch of Constantinople to Gregory himself when he was the papal ambassador there. The cross of Agilulf, her husband, is another beautiful example of late Roman metalwork, richly decorated with semi-precious stones and 4-drop pendants. The gold gospel covers of Theodelinda set classical cameos within a cruciform design decked with the jewels. Thus, royalty and Romanitas were enfolded within a Christian framework of rich theological association. And at a humbler level, the treasury also contains other trophies of pilgrimage. 5 small bags woven out of palm leaves, later associated with the apostles, and 2 fragments of Egyptian woven cloth from the robes of Gregory himself. Other cloths associated with relics were preserved from this period, comprising corporals given to the Pope by the Pope to the Lombard king for use when celebrating the feasts of martyrs, and another cloth associated with a relic of the Virgin Mary. They are precious fragments and examples of so many other highly portable items which have since perished from that time. Such a rich collection also sheds light on the gifts which Gregory the Great sent around the time to the King and Queen of Kent, Ethelbert and Bertha, to accompany St. Augustine's mission to Canterbury in 597. All these demonstrate the potency of Roman Christianity, both artistically and politically. Rome beckoned to the new Christians north of the Alps and to their rulers as limina apostolorum, the thresholds of the apostles Peter and Paul, the closest contact possible for them with the world of the New Testament and the heroic age of early Christian martyrdom. But it was also, Rome, the gateway to the rich culture of the great city, Constantinople itself. Now, around this time, there arose a very distinctive form of pilgrimage emanating from Ireland. Following the call of God to Abraham to leave home and native land, St. Columbanus departed around the year 590 from Ireland with 12 companions as a peregrinus, a pilgrim, and subsequently a missionary, travelling via Brittany to Gaul. After stormy collisions with some of the established bishops and kings there, he managed to found nonetheless several monasteries that became highly influential in later centuries, notably those at Luxeuil and Bobbio. Although he fell out with his companion St. Gall, who worked with other Irish hermits like St Fridolin, evangelising the area around Bregenz in Switzerland, Columbason nonetheless wrote to several of the popes, including Gregory the Great, and also to Pope Boniface IV, asserting that we Irish, inhabitants of the world's edge, are still disciples of St Peter and Paul, and we accept nothing outside the apostolic and evangelical teaching, the Catholic faith as it was first delivered by you, who are the successors of the holy apostles, and is now maintained by us unbroken. Which is an interesting reminiscence of how Christianity came to Southern Ireland from Rome directly at the time of St Patrick, but quite independently of his own mission. Rome featured very strongly in Irish spiritual imagination and loyalty. A poem about St Columba, who died in 597, said that by his mighty skill he kept law firm, Rome was known, order was known, knowledge of God was granted to him. In an Irish saint's life, there is a vivid memory of a pilgrimage to Rome by an Irish peregrinus called Abban. One day, as he was walking by the shore of a harbour in Ireland, he saw 3 ships in the port starting out for Rome. He entered one of the ships to join the pilgrimage to which they were bound. After he was made head of the company of pilgrims, they had a fair journey to Rome. And in Rome they were met by a person who used to give a first night's lodging to every pilgrim who entered the city. He welcomed Abban into his home. And the story ends with Gregory the Great ordaining him as a missionary priest to his own people in Ireland. Another Irish peregrinus, or pilgrim called Baya, also went to Rome, where Gregory the Great wished to ordain him as a missionary bishop. When he lifted his hands up to do so, flames came down from heaven. Even stranger is the story of another saint called Colman, who claimed Gregory at the Golden Mouth, as he described, as his tutor and father in God. Many years later, at home in his monastery in Ireland, he seemed to hear the passing bell of Gregory's death in Rome and fell down distraught. He prayed that his monastic community might also hear the bells, which they did. Well, no one can confirm whether Gregory's impulse to send missionaries to the Anglo-Saxons was not prompted by Irish contacts of this kind. Nonetheless, Christianity came to them from Ireland as well as from Rome, and the Holy City features in many other Irish saints' lives from this period. Towards the end of his ecclesiastical history, telling how Christianity came to the Anglo-Saxons, Bede describes Egbert, a noble Englishman who went to Ireland for his spiritual formation, where he nearly died of plague. Plunged into deep repentance bordering on despair, he vowed to God that if he survived to make amends for his sins, he would live in perpetual exile and never return to his native land of Britain. But Egbert's influence remained strong in the land of his birth, however, until his death in 729. He was instrumental in initiating the mission of St Willibrord to the Low Countries, and also in finally reconciling the island monastery of Iona to the Roman manner of calculating Easter, which proved so controversial and divisive at the Synod of Whitby in 664. St Aidan, the founder of Lindisfarne, was a similar missionary and peregrinus, pilgrim sent earlier from the monastery of Iona at the behest of King Oswald of Northumbria. Bede took great care to convey the spirit and ethos of these Irish missionaries who did so much to nurture Christianity in England in the 7th century. And the personal calendar of St Willibrord is further evidence of how such pilgrimage, with Rome at its heart, formed the spiritual life of this generation of Anglo-Saxon Christians, with its careful commemoration of the Roman saints and martyrs alongside more recent English saints. Bede also records how certain Anglo-Saxon kings made their pilgrimage to Rome at the end of their reigns and died there, as indeed the controversial English bishop Wilfrid of Northumbria, who went back and forth to Rome on numerous and troublesome occasions. Bede's own monastery of Monkmirworth Jarrow was itself a beneficiary of several pilgrimages to Gaul and Rome made by its founder Benedict Biscop. During these journeys, he assembled a significant library of books, which were the foundation of Bede's learning and writing. In his Lives of the Abbot, Bede described how Benedict left his own country and went to Rome, where in fulfilment of his long and ardent desire, he made sure that he visited the tombs of the apostles and venerated their relics. After 2 years of monastic training at the island monastery of Lorrain off Caen in southern France, and being overcome, it says, by love of the Prince of the Apostles, Benedict made up his mind to tread once more the streets made sacred by the presence of St. Peter's body. On his return from a further visit to Rome in 671, he told the King of Northumbria with enthusiasm how many sacred books and holy relics of the blessed apostles and martyrs he had brought back, with a view to creating his own monastery with royal support. And Bede describes how craftsmen and glaziers were brought from France to create a stone building at Monk Wearmouth Jarrow of Roman Gallic design. 2 other trips to Rome brought back more treasures, as Bede also describes in his history. And these included icons to hang in the monastic church, as well as a musician to teach Roman chant. And at the end of his life, Benedict told his monks how on his many pilgrimages he had visited no less than 17 monasteries, collating elements drawn from their various customs around the rule of St. Benedict for the life of his own monastery. And in fact, the earliest remaining copy of the rule of St. Benedict was copied in England at this time. For Bede himself, the Christian world was epitomised in the life and resources of the monastery that nurtured his whole life, education and imagination. Well, few could actually go on pilgrimage those days, however, and the journey to Rome or further afield was long, arduous and dangerous. Instead, the canon of the Mass recalled week by week a panoply of Roman saints and martyrs, many of whose relics were brought to England by Benedict Biscop and others. Patterns of church dedication, for example, at Canterbury, mirrored the dedication of the Roman churches around the Schielian Hill, from where Augustine and his monks came. The Cathedral Church of the Saviour, now Christ Church, the extramural monastery of St. Peter and St. Paul, later called St. Augustine's, the revised Roman chapel of St. Pancras nearby, the parish church of Quattro Coronati, and the ancient Roman chapel of St. Martin, where the mission began. Bede's own monastery had a principal church dedicated to St. Peter and an oratory dedicated to St. Lawrence, the Roman deacon and martyr. So within the liturgical life of the monastery, some replication of Roman patterns of devotion could be made. Bede's own beloved abbot Chelfrey decided to depart on pilgrimage to Rome in 716 to breathe his last breath amid the localities sanctified by the bodies of the blessed apostles and martyrs of Christ. He took with him the remarkable Codex Amiatinus, a complete copy of the Vulgate Bible as a gift for the Pope. But he never got as far as Rome, he died, and this wonderful book is now in the Laurentian Library in Florence. Enormous thing, stands about that high. Bede included in his ecclesiastical history a fascinating account of how the abbot of Iona, Adamna, wrote a book on the holy places based upon information dictated to him by Arculf, a bishop from Gaul, who had visited Jerusalem to see the holy places. He had wandered all over the Promised Land and been to Damascus, Constantinople, Alexandria, many islands of the sea. But as he was returning to his native land by sea, he was cast up by the violence of the tempest onto the western coasts of Britain. After many adventures, he came finally to Adamnan on Iona, who received him very gladly and listened to his words. Adamnan quickly committed to writing everything that Arculf had seen in the holy places and which seemed worthy of remembrance. And Adamnan gave a copy of this book to the King of Northumbria, who was a friend, and thus Bede was able to epitomise it in his own ecclesiastical history. Adamnan also wrote a brilliant life of St. Columba and was a theologian of similar calibre to Bede himself. Bede clearly found the description of places in the Holy Land fascinating and also illuminating of the text of the Bible. Continual fascination with such distant but important biblical locations ensured that Bede's tribute to a damnum was not forgotten. And in the early 12th century, a librarian of the Benedictine monastery of Monte Cassino in Italy, Peter the Deacon, collated Bede's summary of a damnum with a version of Ageria's itinerary, which I mentioned earlier. Someone is not enjoying this at all. Alculf's account, so carefully recorded by a damnum, appreciated by Bede, is matched by the account of another epic pilgrimage undertaken in the middle of the 8th century by an Englishman called Willibald, who later became Bishop of Eichstätt in Germany. And his account was recorded by an English nun called Hunberg at the monastery of Heidenheim. A lot of English missionaries have gone to help create monasteries in Germany on the other side of the Rhine. With his father and brother, Willibald left England from Hamwick near Southampton, crossed to Rouen, and then visiting the shrines of saints that were on their way to Rome and praying there. They reached Lucca in Italy, but the journey had taken its toll on their father, who died there. After a dangerous journey across Italy, they finally made it to Rome, which was their goal, climbing the holy staircase up to St. Peter's Basilica. The summer in Rome brought on fever that nearly killed the two brothers. They travelled on via Naples and Sicily, from there to Greece, from Corinth. They sailed to Ephesus and Miletus in Asia Minor. From there they crossed to Cyprus, Asia Minor again, where they were arrested by Saracens as spies. Finally, they obtained permission to go to Damascus, from where they walked to Galilee to visit Nazareth and Cana. They climbed Mount Tabor, moved on to Tiberias, Capernaum and Bethsaida. They stayed in the monastery at Caesarea before going back to bathe in the River Jordan at the place of the Lord's baptism. Then, lodging first at the monastery of St. Eustochium in the Judean wilderness, they at last reached Jerusalem. Later journeys took them to Syria, to Emesa, winding up in Constantinople, from where they returned to Rome with the Pope's emissaries in 728. Willibald reported his travels to Pope Gregory III, who then sent him with a message for St. Boniface in Germany. His journeys took him a full 7 years before ending his days as Bishop of Eichstätt. The account of his travels is vivid, absorbing, and memorable. The letters of Alcuin of York, who joined the court of Charlemagne in the last part of the 8th century, shed a great deal of light on the hazards of travel to and from Rome at that time. Alcuin travelled to Rome at least twice, perhaps more often. The first time was as a young companion to his master Aelbert, who was Archbishop of York, where Alcuin grew up and was educated. In his famous poem about the Church of York, Alcuin recorded Aelbert's love of travel and pilgrimage, seeking books like Benedict Biscop before him, and strong in his devotion to Rome, its holy places and its monasteries. And it was on his way back from a second visit to Rome to collect a pallium from the Pope for his friend and contemporary Eanbald, the new Archbishop of York, that Alcuin met Charlemagne once again in Parma, who summoned him to join his court. Alcuin's interest in obtaining relics from Rome probably dated from his first encounters with the major Christian shrines of the apostles and martyrs there. Pilgrimage, however, could cause problems, as a diplomatic letter reveals that was probably drafted by Alcuin and sent in 796 from Charlemagne to offer the King of Mercia, the overlord of southern England. Interesting example of an English-European spat about sort of wool lengths and stones and all manner of quarrels and a trade embargo, etc. But anyway, its first item concerned the bona fides of so-called pilgrims on their way from England to Rome, who were actually merchants trying to evade taxes along the way. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Elsewhere, there were reports of English women pilgrims ending up as prostitutes in Italian cities. It was no mean feat to make it safely to Rome and then return to England. There's a striking allusion to Rome and the impact it made upon Alcuin personally in his treatise De Ratione Animae, written in 801 towards the end of his life. Commenting on the nature of memory, Alcuin said that just as a person who has seen Rome has it inscribed in his mind and knows its essential form, so when he hears the name of Rome recalled, he immediately turns his mind into his own memory, where its form lies hidden, and recognising it, he draws it forth. Rome clearly haunted the memory of Alcuin. In a poem he described it as the capital and wonder of the world, golden Rome, now only a barbarous ruin. In a letter to a friend warning him of the hazards of travelling to and within Italy, Alcuin described picking his way along streets lined with ruins on his way to the Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls. In a poem to the new Pope Leo III, Alcuin prayed that the saints would protect him by their holy prayers, whom Rome still holds within the circuit of its mighty walls. Well, the Aurelian walls were, and indeed are, mighty, but the wasteland between the nodes of activity within the confines of the ancient city were no less vast and sad. Strange place of a village here, village there, and sort of dereliction and vineyards and things where the houses had been. Alcuin was in touch with both popes, the formidable Hadrian I and the hapless Leo III. And he composed Charlemagne's epitaph for Hadrian, which can still be seen engraved on black marble from Belgium, high in the portico of St. Peter's Basilica. It was an elegant memorial to a great pope, also an assertion of Carolingian determination to revive the glory of Christian Rome on both sides of the Alps. By the 10th century, archbishops of Canterbury and York had to travel to Rome to obtain the pallium from the Pope personally. It's kind of sort of thing that hung around their necks. You see it on coats of arms. This was the sign of their primacy and also of the close relationship of the English Church with Rome. Thus, in the middle of the 10th century, St. Dunstan made the long journey over the mountains to Rome, a cold journey that had almost finished off one of his predecessors. He got caught with frostbite, had to have his feet plunged into the belly of a slaughtered horse, Pete Warden. Dunstan relied on monastic hospitality along the way, almost running out of supplies on one occasion. He finally arrived in Rome as a pilgrim, where he made offerings at the shrines of the saints and ministered to Christ's poor, before returning in peace on his journeys to his native land. Some of the dreams and the visions of Dunstan have revealed the deep impact that Rome had made upon him. At the end of his life, he had this vision that he was in heaven, singing the Sanctus, in the presence of the Pope in Rome. I mean, that's right at the very end of his life. The calendars and homilies of the later 10th century reflect the awe with which Rome was regarded, despite the fact that the papacy reached its lowest and most sordid ebb at this time. But as a symbol of Christian antiquity and authority, its spiritual potency still eclipsed its manifest weaknesses. Others also made pilgrimage to Rome. For example, a priest called Athos, a bishop called Kenward, and when Oswald became Archbishop of York in 970, he too went to Rome with gifts for the Pope from King Edgar. Another rich Englishman who was blind made the long trek to Rome for healing, but in vain. Only prayer at the shrine of St. Swithin in Winchester saved his sight. Persistent failure to pay Peter's pence, the tribute sent to Rome from England, obliged a person to take it personally to Rome with a 30 pence fine in addition, returning with a certificate to prove they paid it, and then paying a further fine to the king. Probably unenforceable, but nonetheless a statement of intent. Another aristocrat sent to Rome to purchase corruptly a dispensation from his marriage, which Dunstan calmly overturned as Archbishop of Canterbury. But pilgrimage was a good way of sustaining links between churches and clergy, and earlier in the century, during Athos's reign, a bishop of Worcester, had made significant visits to the continental monasteries of St. Gallen, Pfeffer and Reichenau. Dunstan's younger colleague Oswald went for a while on pilgrimage to the monastery of St. Benedict at Fleury, which claimed the saint's body. And Dunstan himself, as abbot of Glastonbury, forged a close link in Flanders, where he experienced reformed monastic life at first hand, while temporarily in exile from England, having challenged the young teenage King Edwin for his immorality. It's told that the king, at his coronation feast, sloped off behind the ox-hide screen at the end of the hall, and they heard all this kerfuffling and sent Dunstan as schoolmaster in to fish him out, and discovered he was in bed with his girlfriend and with his girlfriend's mother. Of course, they were all very young. complete chaos really, and how the housemaster hauled him out, brought him back, and put the crown back on his head. Well, no wonder you were exiled. There remains a record of the pilgrimage route of one of Dunstan's successors, Sigurd, who went to Rome in 990 to collect his pallium. It's quite interesting. In Rome, his first port of call was, of course, St. Peter's Basilica, then the Church of St. Maria in Sassia, in the English enclave close to the Vatican, called the Scola Anglorum. This enclave had been created in the time of Alcuin and Charlemagne as protected accommodation for English pilgrims to Rome. Siguric's pilgrimage around the ruined city took in the major churches of St. Agnesi, San Lorenzo Fuori, San Sebastian, St. Anastasio, St. Paul outside the walls, St. Maria in Scola Grecorum, St. Sabina on the Aventine, St. Cecilia and St. Maria in Trastevere, and nearby also in Trastevere, the church of St. Chrysogons. You can still visit it to this day. On the second day of the tour included St. Maria Rotunda, the Lateran Cathedral, with lunch with the Pope, then on to the papal shrine already created of Jerusalem, with its relics of the Holy Land, that is held by the Lateran Palace. Then to St. Maria Maggiore, St. Peter ad Vincula, and finally back to the tomb of St. Lawrence. This document is also interesting in that it lists all the stages of the journey between the English Channel and Rome, 80 in all. So the whole journey took at least 10 weeks of hard slog, and longer if the weather was bad in the mountains. Meanwhile, Italy was still far from safe for travel. By the time of St. Dunstan, England itself had developed many pilgrimage centres, many of them in the care of the newly restored or created monasteries, whose liturgical life commemorated them. Winchester witnessed the spectacular revival of the cult of St. Swithin, hitherto an obscure 9th century bishop, whose tomb became a major shrine of healing. St. Ethelwold's revival of Ely as a monastery was focused on the memory of its saintly founder, St. Ethelred, icon there, who lived in the 7th century. Appeals were made to Rome, the Pope in Rome, in support of some of these sensational monastic refoundations. The shrine of St. Cuthbert in the north continued to attract English pilgrims, including royalty, when it was safe to travel there. King Athelstan gave lavish gifts to the shrine, some of which remain in Durham Cathedral treasury to this day. Dunstan also travelled there with King Edward, a subsequent king, and was able to testify to the fact that Cuthbert's body was still without decay. Dunstan confirmed that this was true also of the more recent royal martyr, King Edmund of East Anglia, murdered by the Vikings in 869, and whose monastic burial place also became a focus of pilgrimage of the later 10th century Bury St. Edmunds. And there is a graphic description early in the 11th century by a monk of the New Minster at Winchester, who, prompted by a vision of St. Cuthbert, travelled without his abbot's permission all the way to the Saint's shrine, which was then at Chester Street. While there, he was privileged to wash the saint's body, comb and cut his hair, clothe it in new attire, bringing back some of the old clothes as relics. The Liber Vitae, or Register of New Minster, which contains this anecdote, later known as Hyde Abbey, gives a comprehensive picture at the end of the 10th century of how England was full of churches claiming the relics of saints, local or foreign, as places of pilgrimage and veneration. Its relic list reflects the cosmopolitan litany of Western saints that have proliferated across Europe and England during these centuries. And it's perhaps in the calendars and liturgical prayers from the period that the fervour, hopes and devotion of English Christians may best be detected. In the decades before the Norman conquest in 1066, English pilgrims went to Winchester to venerate St. Swithin, to Canterbury to venerate St. Dunstan, and also St. Alphege, an Archbishop of Canterbury murdered by the Vikings in Greenwich in 1012. Their hagiographies testify to some of the many miracles wrought at their tombs or by their intercession. Meanwhile, elaborate liturgies were themselves a form of pilgrimage in and around the chapels of a major church or cathedral, while being surrounded on all sides by frescoes and icons, gold and silver work, many lights and music. England was truly a land of saints of native origin, and also those common to the whole Western Church, whose history and reality was brought near through pilgrimage and through their relics, and by their solemn commemoration each year at Mass in the monasteries, cathedrals, and parish churches. This devotion is also evident in some of the wonderful illuminated manuscripts that remain from this period. For the Anglo-Saxons, therefore, in common with Christians across Western Europe as the first millennium approached, Christianity was global in its ethos and was perceived to be a living spiritual present past that enriched the living and present experience of worship and memory. Pilgrimage at home and abroad, and the veneration of relics, often coming back from pilgrimage, helped to knit this framework of spiritual association together as a true communio sanctorum, a phrase which means not only the communion of saints made tangible by their commemoration, but also the holy places and holy things associated with them. In a turbulent age, Rome remained the focal point of this communio sanctorum, with Jerusalem more distant but no less potent horizon of Christian hope and pilgrimage. There you have it. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much for a most wide-ranging and fascinating account of pilgrims. One thing that particularly intrigued me was how dangerous it was in those days going on a pilgrimage compared with our pilgrimages, which are very comfortable, although they do have their challenges sometimes. So thank you very much indeed.
It's a pleasure.
So the paper is now open for questions and discussions. If anyone has anything to start. I do think someone else would wander around and take
A practical question.
could someone hold the carry the microscope? Thank you very much.
Is it on?
I've always wondered in my practical way how the pilgrims were funded and how they got fed. It could have been from monastery to monastery, but you couldn't carry much treasure with you. It's far and dangerous. So, do we know?
Well, we have plenty of anecdotes of people having narrow escapes. I mean, St Dunstan, for example, was severely chided on his pilgrimage to Rome for having given away the last of their goodies to some poor chaps along the way and ending up stranded with nothing to eat. And he said to the steward, don't get in a state about it, let's stay at the office instead. Irritating thing to say. And then fortunately someone turned up with a meal from the neighbouring monastery laden with stuff. But it is quite true. I mean, you find in the letters of Alcuin, he was a real communicator. He loved this age with so much communication. But it might have been disastrous in other ways. But the thing is, he describes how people go up one valley expecting to meet them, and the others were in the other valley. Literally, there was no real-time communication. So it was a real problem. I think without the hospitality of churches and monasteries, none of it could have happened. And if we look at it the other way around, when St Gregory the Great sent Augustine to England, actually, if you look closely at his letters, both in Bede's history and elsewhere in the Register, you will see that it all had to be very carefully prepared as sort of stepping stones across France. And the stepping stones were not only tangible ones, such as who was going to feed them and stuff, but also the stepping stones, if one can mix metaphors, in order not to tread on the toes of bishops who might feel upstaged. So there was more in it than met the eye. You didn't just send a mission to England. It was the most extraordinary thing to do. It had never been done before by the Pope, and it wasn't done again. It was a one-off. But yes, preparation was the key. But it was dangerous, very much so. Italy too was a problem because it was full of, you could get malaria there at the drop of a hat. So it's like moving into a torrid COVID zone, unprotected. And yes, people died. Many people died in Rome or on the way there. Yeah, it's true. Yes, dear.
Yes, I just wanted to ask you, Douglas. You spoke of many pilgrimages to Rome, and less perhaps the number because of those difficulties to Jerusalem. But has there been any recording, evidence of those who went to Jerusalem that might have taken Mount Athos in on their route?
Not at that stage. I don't know. Well, we don't know. it would depend if you went by sea, where you might stop. But no, it's not recorded. But actually last night when I was going to bed, I suddenly remembered that there was one episode which I forgot to include, which is embedded in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, I think, or is it it's either in the Chronicle or in Ass's Life of King Alfred the Great, in which pilgrims rock up at the king's court who had been to Jerusalem. And there is, and I think he wrote a letter and sent a letter back to the Patriarch of Jerusalem. So there were direct contacts there. But I think that most of the route would have been mainly over land, with short sea crossings. But no, Athos doesn't feature before. No, not at all. Not on the western horizon before 1000. I don't think.
Another question?
Thank you, Douglas. Can you hear all right? Yeah. I lived in Rome in the 1970s, quite a long time, so much of what you said brought back very many memories. And I was thinking how much there still is in Rome which witnesses to the life of the undivided church, which would be a good reason to go there on pilgrimage anyway, I think, now.
Yes.
So that was my first thought. The other thought is that talking about the number of Anglo-Saxons going to Rome, that's evident by the existence of my own college, which was set up as a hospice for Anglo-Saxon pilgrims and only became a seminary after the Reformation.
Yes.
And also that to the left of St. Peter's Square there is the famous Borgo Santo Spirito from the Anglo-Saxon borough.
Yes.
So one assumes that this is a big Anglo-Saxon quarter near the Basilica.
Yes.
And I was also thinking the reference to the pallium was also interesting, because in the pallium given by the Pope to Metropolitan Archbishops, there is a link with the homophorion of an Orthodox bishop. And the pallium is made from wool. There's a whole, the presentation of the lambs that are turned into sheep that provide the wool for the pallia takes place at St. Agnes's Church in the Piazza Navona, and then they're brought up at the Catechism of Sant'Agnese. But it's about putting the lost sheep over the shoulder of the bishop.
Yes, that's right.
Both in the Western Rite and in the Orthodox tradition. It's very moving. I think it's the last thing that's put on the bishop when he's solemnly vested in the middle of the church.
Yes.
And you said lots of associations, so thank you.
There are. Well, I think this is true. I mean, we've had great good luck having the friendship of the Camaldolese Benedictines for many years, and often stayed at San Gregorio, which is the monastery from which Augustine came, on the Chilean hill, and our children have stayed there quite often in their own right. And certainly that corner of Rome, where you can explore all these wonderful, very early churches, and the mosaics of the early period of Pascal II and so on, I think it does bring home to one the fact that, as I mentioned very briefly last night, Rome would have struck people, or today, if you went there in that time, it would have seemed as utterly Byzantine, or precisely what Byzantine churches preserved was normal then. And certainly in the 7th and 8th century, many of the popes were Greeks and Syrians, and so the whole, and during the iconoclast crisis, the Roman Church, of course, upheld images. And you can see in places like Santa Maria Antica and so forth, the way in which these different sort of perceptions were preserved. But I think it is, I think myself that Rome, there's a Rome behind the Baroque, and there's a Rome which is on a very different dynamic to the Vatican. And it's that Rome which certainly, I think, helps to give shape to understanding this period of history. And the very close affinity of the English Church with that kind of Roman Christianity is a striking thing.
And the Church of San Teodoro, near the Forum in Morton, is known as the Greek Quarter, where there are a lot of very ancient churches. That now is it was gifted to the Ecumenical Patriarch.
Yes, was it? Yes.
Yes, so both the church and the collegial buildings around it now are at home in Rome with the Ecumenical Patriarch.
It is a very fascinating thing, and I think in that sense, I think that one has to. I've lost that point. It'll come back to me. Carry on. Too many points.
Another question.
Thank you, Douglas. taking on from the very first question about the journey, could you comment about any spiritual significance to the journey as opposed to the destination? And I suppose I'm thinking particularly from an individual pilgrim as opposed to the hierarchy or the clerics.
I think it was a matter of survival and hard craft. I don't think there was any romance in it. I mean, if you made it, it was a tough thing to do. So I don't think the actual journey particularly significant, except possibly in the Irish tradition of becoming a permanent exile from your home, which was quite an unusual commitment. I think there's a certain ascetic aspect to it. But I think the asceticism is not, I mean, after all their life was a struggle. You know, it was nasty, brutish and short, and if you made it to 45, you were lucky. So I don't think that side of it was the issue. Giving up your home and your kindred, that was a big ask. And of course that's true in the New Testament, you know, that when our Lord challenges people, he's challenging individuals in a society where nobody stepped out of line. They didn't have the opportunity to do so because there wasn't the resource, you know, it was all a matter of whether your family could survive, and you didn't have that freedom. So I think that the freedom, the sort of up-sticks from Ireland particularly, is an example of where there is a real ascetic side to the exercise. But I think otherwise it was the goal that kept you going, and the feeling that you might make it to Rome just once in your life, and you might make it back. And I think that's where it's very different to us, being able simply to clock onto EasyJet, hope as long as they're flying, getting you back, and, you know, thank you very much, and here we are. So I don't think we have a clue how it would have felt, and how very few people would have done it. I mean, the stories that we have are very interesting, but of course they're not representative of most people's experience at all.
Interestingly, that's quite different to the current experience of, for instance, walking pilgrims to Compostela, to Rome, who often say that the journey itself is more important than the destination.
Yes.
And I've walked to Compostela many times with people who have actually bothered going to the cathedral.
Really?
For them, the journey was everything. And it was a transformative experience.
Yeah, it is fascinating.
The destination was less important.
But then the point is today you can journey broadly without risk. I mean, you know, and in that sense I guess you've got more time to reflect. But I think these people, it was a survival course. And tough.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yes, thank you for an interesting talk. I came to think about one thing. On Athos many years ago, I met a man from Holland, from Netherlands, and he had made many walkings to Santiago de Compostela. And now he was on Athos, and he told me at one, when we discussed, he told me that it, as important as to go to a religious site is the question, why do I go back? I mean, now I'm here, why on earth should I go back to from where I left?
Yes.
If there were some problems, so there's no reason to go back. And he was pondering this, why should I go back? Shall I go back? And there are very little written about this problem. I mean, many journeys when you go there, but then the question why to go back, there's no answer to that. Normally in those stories.
And of course,
have you come across any?
Well, yes, I think in some of the saints' lives and documents from the period, you do get people for whom it's a one-way ticket. And I mean, certainly some of those, let's say those Anglo-Saxon kings who decided to pack it in and go to Rome and you know, became monks and things and lived there and died there. They made that deliberate choice. And I think in that also, I mean, given the nature of the problems of travel and life generally, I mean, people did stay where they did say goodbye to their home country. So yeah, it's true. So you do get stories of that. I think you do. Perhaps not many at this time. But of course, I mean, this was fishing out. It was quite an interesting challenge, really, to ask oneself what could one say about pilgrimage in the West up to the year 1000, because obviously there aren't really very many sources. I mean, the ones I've mentioned, I think, are the principal ones, and some of them are very interesting to read, like the Bishop of Eichstätt's grand tour of the Mediterranean, extraordinary, really. But they're very unusual, and so their singularity mustn't blind us to the the more mundane or even more typical experience of those people who did go, for whom it wasn't perhaps such a great experience. But it was rare. I mean, people didn't travel. That's the point. And letters took a long time to get from A to B. Yes.
I know a little bit about connections between the Celtic Church and the monks, especially the monks and nuns, and the monasticism in Egypt. But I don't know what happened sort of when the Anglo-Saxon Church started to turn more Romewards. Did that continue, this connection? Or did it shift? Or is something known about this?
In the case of the Anglo-Saxon Church, of course, the two, as it were, Roman orientations were, well, number one, primarily because Augustine came from Rome with the Pope's approval, and secondly, because the Irish themselves were devoted to Rome. So one has to be very careful when thinking about this period that people project onto it all sorts of fantasies, and I'm not myself.
Maybe I'm guilty of that. I was thinking also of what you said about the synod in Whitby.
Yes, but I think again that is often wheeled out in a rather sort of overblown manner. I mean, I don't think for a moment that they thought they were. The difference over calculation of Easter was also the difference of Christian faith. And also, to be fair to the Irish Church, they were using a method of calculating Easter that had been normal in Rome 150 years earlier, which was when the mission of Palladius went to Italy, went to Ireland. I think that, so I think the Roman orientation was there right the way through. But, and I don't think myself that there should be, I don't personally buy into the whole Celtic Church mythology. I think it's nonsense. I think there's a continuum. It's one of the reasons I wrote the book that I did. But I think, taking your earlier point, there is no doubt, and artistic and other bits and pieces confirm, that there were significant connections with East Mediterranean monastic life in Syria and Egypt through what we call the Dark Ages, i.e. the 5th and 6th centuries. And it's very hard for us to quantify because there's really so very little that's left. But what we have to remember, and what I wanted to try and illustrate by mentioning Monza, was that where you do see fragments of small things, including woven material, that could be transported easily, there is no question that these were potent influence artistically and also religiously. So that it is quite true to say that the monastic life around the periphery of the western coasts in the 5th and 6th century definitely had connections with the East Mediterranean, which is true, yes. But again, I think we have to be very careful not to romanticize the whole thing. I think it doesn't do any favours. It rather distances the story. But there was a link, sure. There was.
People who go on long journeys, pilgrimages, often like to bring back some token, something tangible, to show they have actually been there. Can you give any instances of this?
Well, yes, I think what I mentioned from the Monza treasury is a very good example of that. Because the point is, at that stage, relics were not bones.
Steel.
Yeah, they're just breaking up of bodies for something that belongs to the later Middle Ages. A rather dubious aspect, really. But in those days, relics were by association. So, oil that had been, as is still true among Orthodox today, oil that came from lamps burning in front of shrines, dust, actually. They also created in the tombs apertures down which they could drop sort of cloths, which as it were touch the relics. So those were the relics that people brought back, which of course were eminently portable, and which were not exactly so sort of sacred as to be something that ordinary people couldn't handle. And the reliquaries, the creation of reliquaries is perhaps a significant development in the 4th and 5th century. But even they would have been little boxes in which these bits and bobs took place. And actually, there was a very interesting archaeological find up in Scotland, Galloway, I think, was it? It was a kind of pot in the ground. And in it was definitely those sort of objects, kind of some little treasure pot that had got buried along with a whole load of others. It was a very famous Scottish archaeological site recently discovered. So that was a tiny glimpse, of how something could be treasured. And they would have been very rare. I mean, Bede, when he was dying, asked for his little treasure box to be brought in to give to various of the clergy around him. Incense, for example, pepper, This is very charming. There are very few things. These were the few precious things which represented for him this wider world to which he'd never travelled himself, except in his imagination. I mean, if Bede went as far as York, that's probably the limit of his journeys. And yet in his mind, and through his books, and through the literature, and through these sort of tangible fragments, he was able to conjure, is perhaps not quite the right word, but in a way conjure the whole, and communicate the whole early world of Christian belief. So, these portable things.
Were there any metal tokens?
Sorry?
Any metal tokens?
Well, I think these ampullae were an example of that, because the ones that came in Monza, which are they're not the only ones, but they're a very fine collection. They came from Palestine, and they were made of stamped lead, I think. So they were sort of, and had bas relief on either side. And then in it was the oil from the whichever shrine it was. So I think those and I guess things like small crosses and other tiny things like that, yes. But not on a big scale, certainly not a commercial or industrial scale. We have to be careful not to project back onto this period some of the vagaries of the High Middle Ages, shall we say, or the things that would, cause the Reformation or prevent people like me from kissing intangible objects and all that sort of thing. So, but in this early period, association was the, and I think, as I mentioned last night, we really could make a case for association closely connected to books. It does seem to me that books at this time also fulfilled that sort of role, not just to be collected and read, but also because of where they came from and those with whom they were associated. And I think you could make a strong case, and could have made a case actually today, for books as part of this story. You have a question?
Well, someone over there, I think, had a question. Yes.
No,
I think no, he's got a microphone. It might have to be the last question if we're going to.
Elizabeth, you have a question, I think.
Okay, well, that'll be the last one. No, yours will be the last one. Okay, carry on over there.
Douglas, please, from Wyndham Winchester, to hear the name of Swithin. You mentioned a lot of names, but one name you didn't mention, and I'm slightly curious as to why not, was St. Barinus.
Why didn't I? Only because I knew that I'd otherwise get hammered by a certain person for ramming in far too many names and stuff. Barinus, yes, I mean, it's an interesting figure, because of course where I live was exactly his patch. Dorchester-on-Thames is one of my favourite places. And Barinus, of course, is an interesting example of a missionary who came from what we now call France, with the blessing of the Pope, but not at the Pope's initiative. And one of the things that gets a bit overlooked, I think, is the degree to which the French Church itself sort of sent in missionaries at the same sort of time to England, of which Barinus is one, the others, Felix and so forth. So yes, Barinus is of course interesting, and Dorchester was where he baptised the first King of Wessex, with the King of Northumbria as his godfather, because he married a princess from Northumbria. And then later in that century, the bishopric was moved to Winchester. So in a sense, Barinus is a founding figure of the Winchester diocese. It's quite true. But I didn't think actually that he ever had the same pull. I mean, the Swithin story is quite extraordinary. And actually, for those who wish to take a slightly more detached view of these things, a splendid example of almost, the psychosis of religion in a way. Because this obscure saint, people start tripping over his tomb and get wrapped over the stone. And then it's cashed in on by St. Ethelwald as a tremendous rallying point to browbeat the existing clergy of Winchester into accepting the new monastic arrangements. And people come from far and wide, and it becomes a great cult of healing, and they have to build a huge church and all the rest of it. And it's big business, really. So, I mean, the Swithin story is a sort of rather ambivalent one, I think. Barinus is a more humble fellow who has sort of just about survived for those that go to places like Dorchester. Are we there?
One more question. Still have a question. Thank you very much. And actually the last question, I think. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm interested in the British centres of pilgrimage. Would these primarily have been places that individuals would go for healing or some need, or would there have been large, more organised pilgrimages on the Saint's Day or some such, and groups of people travelling there together?
I think they would have done. I mean, I think if you read the Regularis Concordia, which was drawn up in the 10th century to regulate monasteries, I mean, one of the striking things there is that around the revived observation of the rule of St. Benedict is a whole carapace of stuff which is doing justice to what was already going on in the English church. And certainly processions and celebrations of saints' days on quite a large scale by their standard was quite normal. So certainly places like Winchester and Canterbury, I think particularly on high days, would have drawn people from far and wide. But again, we have to be careful not to project back onto it sort of Chaucer and the scale of, say, the Becket cult and that sort of thing. I don't like that at all. But I think the one of the things we have to recognise is that the liturgical celebration, as I mentioned en passant, within the church or around the neighbourhood at certain times, itself was a sort of pilgrimage, and therefore these places, had a sort of resonance, and they certainly some of the Carolingian churches were, studied with chapels, so that the whole thing was a kind of liturgical dance all around, and because, as we see in Byzantine churches today, high visual culture. I think that's the thing English people find very hard to understand, because the Normans destroyed all the Anglo-Saxon cathedrals very deliberately, and there are very few churches left of that period, and none of them carry anything like the decoration that we know was the case. But if we read the poetry or some of the other descriptors, then you can actually see that they would have been resplendent with visual art on the walls, and also they were great metal workers. So I mean, beautiful altar frontals and all this kind of stuff in silver and gold, and lanterns and chandeliers and the works really, and small churches too. They were not, a few were very big. So it's very hard. We have no visual image of that world really. I remember when I first went to Kiev, particularly, that at that point when I was completing my work on St. Dunstan, I think that really did sort of bring home to me more clearly, visually, what it would have been like, because the development of Kiev mirrors very much what was happening in England in the 10th century, and fortunately, some of it still survives, fingers crossed.
Thank you very much. Well, can we show our appreciation to Father Douglas for a most stimulating talk to start?